In the news recently was a story about Essex County Council being the worst county in England for completing education, health and care plans within the statutory 20-week timeline. And there was a clip of the head of SEND Strategy and Innovation for Essex, Ralph Holloway, in Chambers, saying that Essex only met that statutory timeline in 1% of cases. Although that's a very bleak statistic, I know that there's lots more behind that story than was reported in the news at the time. So I reached out to Ralph and to Janine Hanson, who is the Quadrant Manager for North East Essex, and asked them to join me for a conversation to understand how did we get to this situation and what is the plan to make improvements. With the statutory 20-week timeline, what this means is that a parent or an education provider can make a request to the local authority to undertake an education healthcare needs assessment with a view to issuing an education health and care plan. If the local authority agree to undertake the education healthcare needs assessment and as a result agree that they will complete an education health and care plan, they then have a 20-week period from the date at which the application for the EHC needs assessment was made to completion of the final plan. 20 weeks is what that time should be. But yet we're missing that in Essex. Hello, Ralph and Janine. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming down here to meet with me. I know how busy you both are and what a lot of pressure you're both under. So I really appreciate you taking the time out to come to speak to me. And what I really want to do here is help parents have a better understanding about the current situation. I feel that there's a lot of messages of hopelessness around provision for children and young people with SEND. And I know the situation is bleak, but I think that it's not hopeless. There's lots of ways in which we can get good outcomes for children and young people. And I just want families to have access to more information. So obviously, as we're talking about this situation in Essex, my first question has to be, how did we get to this situation, or why are we the worst in the whole of England at meeting that statutory timeline?
Sure, thanks. So I think it's worth saying that this isn't something that's happened overnight. So we've not gone from 100 to 1% in the space of a year. It's taken time. We were at a stage where we were completing our needs assessments in a really timely fashion, and there was a trajectory of significant improvement. I think it's probably safe to say there are a combination of smaller factors and then one large overwhelming factor.
So you've said there's a number of smaller factors and one large factor, which is the availability of educational psychologists. Just give us a little bit more information about all of those factors.
There are some factors around what we do with those young people when we get to the end of an assessment, and some of the other pressures that are on our SEND teams in terms of placement, in terms of annual reviews. All of that is work that's done by the same team.
Can you just explain that to me? Placements and annual reviews, what's the hold-ups there?
So at the end of the needs assessment, the SEND Ops team will work with the parent and consult local schools. That's not always the experience, and so it does become more challenging in some cases to find an appropriate placement.
So just to clarify what you said there, when you refer to SEND Ops, you're meaning the SEND operations team,
Yep.
which is the team responsible for undertaking the EHC needs assessments and issuing the EHCPs, which is in North East. That's your area, correct, Janine?
Yeah, so we've got two aspects of SEND support for families and schools. Part of that is SEND operations, which you've just said are the team that undertake not just the statutory assessments, but then support the annual review process and placement finding for those young people as well. So the different roles within that team, I won't go into them now, but a lot of your families will have heard about SEND operations coordinators. Our coordinators are the people that gather and collate the information and support the writing of an EHC needs assessment if it's agreed by the local authority.
Yeah, brilliant.
And then I just wanted to mention as well, because we do have a sort of another paired and partner team, which is our SEND operations and SEND inclusion and psychology team, and our educational psychologist employed by the local authority sit in that team, but also undertake other work for the authority as well.
So big team there.
Very big team.
So obviously what you're saying is the SEND operations team undertake the assessment, and the process, part of that process is consulting with schools to see which school could meet the needs as identified in that plan. So that was one of the hold-ups that you mentioned there. Why is there a hold-up with that?
Because not all of our schools are responding as positively as we would like to consultations.
And I get that, because schools are overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed. It's what they're being asked to do is an impossible job, and I can understand why. If they receive an education, health and care plan that identifies a complex set of needs that's going to be resource intensive for them, how overwhelmed they are, you can sort of see why that might be a challenge for them to agree. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it very hard for families, doesn't it?
And actually, so that you kind of just hit on a really good point where you talk about complex needs, because we are definitely seeing higher level need coming through the system. There are more young people with severer needs in the system. So if we just had an increase in volume on its own, that would be a challenge. But to add to that, the complexity of need, identifying an appropriate placement becomes more challenging as well.
Yeah, and that's something that none of us know the reason why there are more children needing this kind of support, why the need is more complex. And I think that's something where we have to look to our colleagues in the healthcare profession who are undertaking research to look at this. And it's not because, as the headlines like to suggest, we're just talking about it more, we know more about it. I mean, you can't deny the statistics that show there are just more children with complex needs.
And I think that's borne out by the fact that we've just got more children with an education and healthcare plan in Essex. You know, we've assessed them, so we are absolutely agreeing with the parent at the end of that. Your child needs an education and healthcare plan. And we have a higher number of children at higher bands, which suggests the level of need is also higher as well, and more children in our special schools. Clearly, we have an increasingly complex SEND population, and we need to have the appropriate provision for them.
So before we move on to thinking about what has been undertaken to look and review this, one of the other elements that you've mentioned just now, in addition to education providers, was about annual reviews. Do you want to just come back and say, how is that issue around annual reviews impacting upon this?
So I'll let Janine answer the practical element on the ground, but essentially what we've got is an increasing population overall. So every year we have more children who come into the SEND population than leave it, because we have less children at the higher ages than we have at the lower ages. So the volume of annual reviews that need to be undertaken by schools and settings and processed by the local authority every year is increasing. So it just means more work in the team, and obviously it's not just about the volume of work, because we want to be better at doing all of this. We were just saying, let's complete the needs assessments more quickly, let's get the annual reviews done more effectively in terms of time, but not having the focus also on the quality of the plan and the quality of the annual review process. Then the product, for want of a better word, at the end of it would not be good enough, and we wouldn't be able to say to our parents, we're doing the best for your children and young people.
Yeah, and just to come back from the experiences that I've had in looking at annual reviews, I've seen a few annual reviews where it's clear that the school have not year on year been referring back to the EHCP. What has been happening for the person writing the reviews, they've referred back to the previous annual review. So what we have is children who've had year on year going through the system with plans that are actually pretty outdated, and nobody's actually had eyes on those. So I think that's another complexity within this, is that the quality of writing of the annual reviews and the scrutiny that goes in looking at, does that match up with what's in the EHCP?
As Ralph said, once you've completed an EHCP, that child will absolutely then be, we'll be looking for that first annual review for that child, looking at a child making progress within their setting as part of that annual review. But we are also looking at improvements in terms of annual reviews, and have a current pilot with some of our schools, and of course families will be involved in that, to really look at exactly as you've just shared, so really sort of bringing to life the EHCP a lot more within an annual review, and making it more fit for purpose. So that's a sort of current pilot that's underway, and will feed into improvement planning. So we've got that strand happening, as well as our EHC needs assessment improvement strand.
And it's great to hear you both describing what's going on here with such specificity and detail, because that's exactly what's missing when you have this headline grabbing story about Essex is the worst, and that you're all looking at how to address that. I think that really means a lot. That's very helpful. So I just want to then come back to the starting point, which is around this increase in numbers that we've seen of young people and their families seeking an EHC needs assessment with a view to an EHCP, the increase in complexity. Can you flesh that out for us for a little bit more about how much of an increase are we talking here and over what period of time?
So I think we kind of frame it in terms of the reforms back in 2014. From 2015 to now, we've had a 75% increase in the number of children with an education healthcare plan for whom we're responsible. So not all of those children will live in Essex. Some of them will be children who looked after, who placed out the authority, and not all of them will be in an Essex school or setting, but the majority of those young people are. So we've got responsibility now for over 13,000 plans, and it was 7,500 in 2015. At the same time, the number of requests for assessment has risen significantly as well. We've gone from about 1,500 in 2015 to just under 4,000 a year in 2023. That's a lot of information and paper and data processing and activity within SEND teams. And so it is an enormous increase in the amount of work. Then thinking about how do we measure complexity? I think that one of the best ways we can do that is think about what the special school population looks like over the same time period. That's gone from around 2,500 to 3,700. So we've had a significant increase, 50% in that population as well.
Yeah, and actually what you've mentioned there comes back to something I have noticed myself in my own career and that I share with families. From my experience, when the Children and Families Act was brought in 2014, it was actually rushed through Parliament because it was the end of that government. And the amount of money that had been promised to implement those reforms was axed because we then headed into this period of austerity. It was quickly pushed out to local authorities, quickly pushed out to schools within the autumn term, where schools and education professionals had not been adequately prepared for that. And I feel like we've been on the back foot ever since in terms of the preparedness to deliver what was in the Children and Families Act already then.
I think that's something that's borne out by the inspection outcomes for a lot of, particularly larger local authorities. I mean, there are some fantastic outcomes for some authorities in terms of their inspections, but the longer they had to implement the reforms, and so obviously the judgment that was being made about where you should be against where you are, the more authorities weren't getting through that inspection process. And we've now got a new inspection process. And unfortunately, that's being borne out again. There are a lot of authorities that under Ofsted's criteria, Ofsted CQC, the local area isn't meeting the needs of children and young people with SEND well.
So now here we are thinking about Essex and the increase there that you've just outlined for us, including the volume and complexity. Obviously, we're all going to be thinking about, well, we're talking about capacity within the existing team there, aren't we? And this has not just been an overnight thing, as you said at the beginning. Can you outline for us a little bit about what's been going on then these last, 10 years in terms of surely people at the very top have been seeing these year-on-year increases. How's that been reflected in decisions that were made? I mean, I know those are not all your decisions, but if you've got any information about that you can share, I think it'd be really helpful.
So there's been, I guess, a phased approach to which the changes were made within the education teams. The first point of that was back in 2018, where we moved from centrally managed SEND teams to a quadrant structure. And that's where the role of the quadrant manager and assistant directors within the quadrants was created. The next phase was looking at those individual teams within each of the quadrants, so educational psychology, what was the specialist teacher team, and what was statutory assessment, and how they work in a quadrant setting. We moved away from a specialist teacher model to something that was more strategic in terms of the relationship with schools, inclusion partners. Stat assessment became SEND operations, and our education psychology teams were part of the inclusion and psychology teams within each quadrant. Unfortunately, the timing for the launch of those services wasn't great, Sue, because it was January 2020, and then something came along that meant that the way in which we intended those teams to work from the outset was severely impeded. So the intention from the start for inclusion partners and educational psychologists is that they would be a really close link with their schools, and they would be meeting their schools and setting up this great new service. But of course, we were in lockdown, and so the ways of working that we intended were challenging, to say the least. We then saw, I've talked about the increases overall since 2015. There was definitely a spike from 2020. You can almost date it in terms of requests for assessment to the point at which the first lockdown ended and children came back into school. So there was a process of understanding what that meant for us. Is this a long-term thing? What should we be doing about our teams? What changes do we need to make? Do we need to invest? We were able to get some COVID funding, which enabled some temporary increase in capacity in the Send Ops team, and then literally within the last 12 months, that's become a more permanent funding increase, which has enabled the teams to expand. And we are now looking at what we need to do beyond that, in recognition of the fact that even with that increased capacity, we've still got significant challenges in the system.
That's helpful information. And just to clarify there, the changes that you mentioned there around educational psychologists, inclusion partners. So as I've understood that, those people with those roles working together in teams around a cluster of schools. They're like the SEND support team for the professionals working within those education settings. So we're talking about educational psychologists, inclusion partners that maybe had come from specialist teacher roles, maybe not, but that kind of advice for schools, and also engagement facilitators who are helpful in enabling families and education settings to communicate well with each other and agree outcomes, that kind of thing. And then around safeguarding and early years, there were those teams, correct, that were put together to support the schools.
To have a team that was much closer to its locality and to its community of schools. I'm not saying that the system used to be a lot of people sitting in County Hall and area offices and not having a connection with their teams, but we moved specifically to a model that enabled schools to feel better supported by a family of professionals who were directly linked to them.
And I think parents' experiences have been that where they have had meetings and their inclusion partner has been invited to attend, that has been helpful. And I know that the engagement facilitators have worked well with families as well. So there is a model there that has got some benefits, that has proven to be effective if it maybe was not implemented within the time frame and the way in which it had been envisaged in the first place. So that was something about some of the initial steps then that were taken really back from the 2014 reforms up until now. So I was wondering, Janine, if maybe you want to say a little bit more about the structure of the SEND operations team then, who are the team that sit under your leadership, that are responsible for undertaking the needs assessment and making those decisions whether to assess or not, deciding whether to issue a plan or not, putting together the plan and finalising them, including consulting with education partners about whether that school setting can meet the need. So obviously you have quite a diverse team that Ralph has mentioned has been expanded. Can you just explain a little bit more about what those changes have been and who are the key roles that now exist within the team?
So with a focus on the SEND operations team, Sue, I think it's really important to share that actually when a child has an education and healthcare plan, and we've already talked about annual reviews, there may be times in their lives, such as looking ahead to a sort of a post-16 educational offer and key times of transition, that actually it's not just the team that focuses on EHC needs assessments that's involved. We have our SEND operations partners that are linked to sort of key schools, a bit like Ralph was saying, so within that community of schools as well. And they are also the line managers of SEND operations coordinators that, as we've said already, undertake and support the writing of the EHC needs assessment and the finalisation process, etc. But we also have key partners as well called SEND Ops assistants, and the assistants do a lot more than assist. They're the ones on the phones to families, updating them when we might be consulting with schools, and as well as under the direction of the SEND operations partner, sharing information with schools and families, such as issuing a final EHCP, for example, or an amended EHCP. They are often a first point of call as well. In North East Essex, because I am going to talk about North East Essex because that's where many of the families that are watching this will be from, we've had significant changes in the personnel of those teams, and we have been able to secure what is a full team in terms of our full-time equivalent capacity within that team about 1 week ago. So
yay for that,
which is great.
Yeah.
And what I will say, and I know it's really important, and I'm hoping that families have this experience as well, is that many new members of the team are enthusiastic, dedicated just as much as our sort of existing members as well. So we've got a really vitalised new send operations team, which I think is going to be really instrumental. But I wanted to mention that because some of them are very new, and some of them we've had gaps therefore in terms of vacancies since September until now, even when we've agreed some of these personnel. I think it's just really important to know that we're aware that that's had an impact as well on effective communication with our families.
Well, what I want to just say there about that, Janine, is that, you know, I've met lots of your team, and I know, same as you two here, passionately dedicated to getting good outcomes. You don't come into a job like that because you like paperwork. No. You come in because you want to make a difference. And I always think it must be really frustrating for the families who are waiting, and I see that all of the time. But what I also see is a bunch of really dedicated people working incredibly hard to try and do the best job they can. And in the same way that we don't blame nurses because we've maybe had to have a long wait for a hospital appointment, it's, for me, it's kind of the same. You've got these dedicated people doing a really hard job in a challenging landscape that you've painted a picture for us of, who are doing the best that they can, led by people who really care about it. So I think that's, I just wanted to reflect that back to you.
Thank you, Sue. And it's so true that nobody came into the service to fail children and young people or their families. People who work for SEND-Ops, people who work in the SEND quadrant teams are extremely passionate and want nothing but the best. And we know that best is not what they're getting at the moment, and that hurts. We realise it doesn't hurt on the same scale as it will do for those families, but if we could send one message to parents and families, we want your experience to be so much better, and we are working very hard to try and make that the reality.
Yeah, I believe that. And also, I think it's hard, isn't it? Because you are, well, particularly you, Ralph, have been like the public face of this story. And it's a little bit hard sometimes for me to watch the angry messaging that comes in around people in positions of authority within Essex and not being uncaring. Now, I know that neither of you are here today because you're, oh, boo-hoo, poor me, everyone hates me. But I think it's really important that people understand that you've got good people doing a good job in really difficult circumstances. And actually, we need people like you to stay. And that's why, for me, it feels really important that we have a conversation. Here you are, come to speak to me today because you want parents to be reassured. You're not here to say, poor me, but you're here to actually try and give people good information and show them about, you know, what the plan is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm big and ugly. I have to be able to take some of it, and actually I understand it. If I was in a parent's position, I wouldn't be happy with the situation, fighting hard and working to get it better.